The acrid scent of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and sickening, was the first warning. Elara, barely 17, had been humming as she mended a tear in her father's canvas hunting coat, the late afternoon sun slanting through the single window of their small, rough-hewn cabin. The Oregon Territory was a promise, her father had said, a new beginning. But the air that suddenly thickened with alarm spoke of endings. A shadow fell across the doorway, too large, too swift. Before she could scream, a figure was there, bronze skin gleaming with sweat and streaks of ochre paint, eyes like obsidian chips under a severe brow. He was Modoc. The stories, whispered in hushed, fearful tones by other settlers, crashed into her mind, savage, merciless. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The cabin, her small sanctuary, became a trap. She saw the dark stain on his leather legging, the fresh blood on the hatchet tucked into his belt, and a cold dread seeped into her bones, paralyzing her. He moved with a predator's grace, his gaze sweeping the room, dismissing the meager furnishings, settling on her. She scrambled back, her chair clattering to the floor, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle the cry that threatened to betray her terror. This was it. The brutal end she had heard of in those terrifying tales. He said nothing, his face an unreadable mask of harsh lines and shadows. He gestured with the hatchet, a flick of the wrist towards the door. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind replayed her father's cheerful whistle as he'd gone to check the snares that morning, her mother's gentle hum. Where were they? The metallic scent grew stronger, and a wave of nausea threatened to buckle her knees. The Modoc warrior took a step closer, and Elara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow she was certain would come. She could smell the forest on him, pine, damp earth, and something wilder, something untamed. Each beat of her heart was a countdown. She expected the searing pain, the swift darkness. Her life, so new, so unlived, was about to be extinguished. But the blow never landed. Instead, a rough hand gripped her arm, not with crushing force, but with an undeniable strength that pulled her upright. Elara's eyes snapped open, wide with a confused terror. The warrior, Suleka she would later learn his name, grunted, a low sound in his throat, and nudged her again towards the door. He wasn't killing her here. Was he taking her somewhere else? The thought offered no comfort, only a prolongation of the agony. As she stumbled out into the fading light, the full horror of the scene struck her. The small vegetable patch, her mother's pride, was trampled. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the smouldering remains of their lean-to shed. And then she saw them. Her parents. Still. Too still. A strangled sob escaped her, a sound of pure desolation. The warrior's grip tightened, a silent command to keep moving. He didn't look at the bodies, didn't acknowledge her grief. He was a force of nature, implacable, focused. He pushed her forward, away from the ruin of her life, towards the dense, darkening forest that bordered their claim. Her legs felt like lead, her mind a maelstrom of shock and despair. Each step was an agony, a betrayal of the life that had been stolen. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose stone, and cried out, more in anguish than pain. He stopped, his dark eyes briefly assessing her. She expected impatience, a harsh tug. Instead, he surprised her. He reached down, his movements economical, and with surprising gentleness, examined her ankle. His fingers, calloused and strong, probed the swelling flesh. Elara flinched, not from pain, but from the unexpectedness of the touch. He straightened, then tore a strip of cloth from a pouch at his waist and, with deft movements, bound her ankle. It wasn't an act of kindness, she told herself fiercely. It was pragmatic. He needed her to walk. Yet, it was the first deviation from the script of brutality she had so firmly believed in, a tiny, perplexing anomaly in the landscape of her terror. He then unslung a water skin from his shoulder and offered it to her. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked, but suspicion warred with desperate need. He made an impatient gesture. She took it, her hand trembling, and drank, the cool water a small, temporary solace in an ocean of dread. The journey began in earnest as twilight bled into a moonless night. Sulek moved through the undergrowth with a silence that was unnerving, a ghost in the trees. Ilara, clumsy and heartbroken, stumbled constantly, the rawhide binding on her ankle offering some support but not enough to prevent jolts of pain. He never offered a hand, but neither did he strike her for her slowness. He merely adjusted his pace, a subtle accommodation that confused her as much as his earlier actions. The forest was a labyrinth of unseen obstacles and unfamiliar sounds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the sigh of the wind through the towering pines, the distant howl of a wolf. Fear was a constant companion, but beneath it, a sliver of something else began to grow, a desperate, unwilling curiosity about her captor. Why was she still alive? Why the rudimentary care for her ankle? The stories hadn't prepared her for this quiet intensity, this unnerving pragmatism. Hours passed, measured by the ache in her limbs and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Sulek offered her a piece of dried meat, its taste unfamiliar and smoky. She ate it mechanically, her gaze fixed on his shadowed profile whenever he paused. He seemed as much a part of the wilderness as the ancient trees, his senses attuned to every nuance of their surroundings. Once, a branch, heavy with unseen weight, cracked ominously above them. Before Ilara could react, Sulek's arm shot out, shoving her hard. She sprawled onto the damp earth as the massive limb crashed down precisely where she had been standing. He pulled her up without a word, his expression unchanged, and resumed walking. The air in her lungs hitched. He had saved her. Not from himself, perhaps, but from the indifferent cruelty of nature. It was another crack in the wall of her assumptions. He wasn't a monster from a tale, he was a man, albeit a dangerous and enigmatic one, making choices she couldn't fathom. The realization didn't lessen her fear, but it complicated it, seeding it with a bewildering thread of reluctant dependence. She was his captive, her life entirely in his hands, yet he had twice acted to preserve it, in small, almost imperceptible ways. They reached the Modoc camp as the first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky. It wasn't a permanent village, but a temporary encampment nestled in a shallow, wooded ravine, almost invisible until they were upon it. Several hide lodges, conical and austere, blended with the muted colors of the forest floor. Wisps of smoke rose from a central fire pit, carrying the scent of roasting meat and something herbal. As Sulek led her into the clearing, a hush fell over the few figures already moving about. Dark eyes, curious and hostile, fixed on Ilara. Children, initially bold, scurried behind their mothers at the sight of her, a pale-skinned stranger in their midst. She felt shrink under their collective gaze, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm. This was a world utterly alien to her, a place where she was the intruder, the unwelcome other. Sulek spoke briefly to an older man with deeply etched lines on his face and hair streaked with grey, his voice low and guttural. The elder's eyes, sharp and intelligent, scrutinized Ilara, lingering on her bound ankle, her torn dress, the terror she knew was still plain on her face. He responded to Sulek with a series of short, clipped words, his expression unyielding. Ilara didn't understand the language, but the tension was palpable. She was a problem, a disruption. Sulek then guided her to a small, unoccupied lodge near the edge of the camp, little more than a crude shelter of branches and hides. He gestured for her to enter. Inside, it was dim and smelled of earth and old smoke. A few worn furs lay on the ground. He left her there without a word, and she heard the distinct sound of a hide flap being secured from the outside. She was a prisoner, again. The brief, confusing flickers of something other than pure menace from Sulek were now overshadowed by the stark reality of her situation. She was alone, surrounded by people who likely saw her as an enemy, a symbol of the encroachment that threatened their way of life. The despair she had kept at bay during the grueling journey threatened to overwhelm her. She sank onto the furs, the rough texture scratching her skin, and finally let the tears come, silent sobs shaking her weary frame. Days blurred into a disorienting pattern of confinement and brief, supervised excursions. A stoic woman, her face a mask of impassivity, brought Ilara meager rations of food, usually a thick, unsalted stew of unfamiliar roots and occasional scraps of meat, and water. Communication was non-existent. Ilara's attempts at tentative smiles or gestures of thanks were met with blank stares or a curt nod before the woman retreated, leaving Ilara to her solitude and gnawing uncertainty. Sulek she saw only occasionally, from a distance, as he moved about the camp or conferred with other warriors. He never approached her lodge, never acknowledged her presence after that first day. The brief connection she had felt, or perhaps imagined, during their journey through the forest seemed to have vanished. Frustration grew alongside her fear. She tried to speak to the woman, using the few English words she thought might be understood: water, food, why? But received no response. She tried gestures, pointing to herself, then to the forest in the direction of her ruined home, a question in her eyes. The woman merely shook her head, her expression unchanging. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, Ilara managed to slip a small, carved wooden bird her father had made for her into the woman's hand as she collected the empty food bowl. It was a simple thing, but precious to her. The woman paused, her fingers closing around the bird. For a moment, Ilara thought she saw a flicker of something in the depths of those dark eyes: surprise? Curiosity? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The woman pocketed the bird without a word and left. The next morning, however, when her food was delivered, there was an extra piece of dried fruit beside the bowl. It was a tiny gesture, almost insignificant, yet it felt like a monumental breakthrough, a fragile thread of contact in the suffocating silence. Later that week, while being allowed a short walk near the stream under the watchful eye of a young warrior, Ilara saw a small child tumble and scrape his knee. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than fear, she moved towards him. The young guard tensed, his hand going to the knife at his belt. Ilara froze, then slowly knelt, her hands open and visible. She spoke softly, words he wouldn't understand but in a tone that was universally soothing. The child, sniffling, looked from her to the wary guard. Sulek appeared then, as if from nowhere. He observed the scene for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He spoke to the guard in Modoc, then to the child, who, after a hesitant glance at Ilara, allowed Sulek to examine his knee. Sulek cleaned the scrape with water from the stream and a leaf Ilara recognized as plantain, often used for minor wounds. As he worked, his eyes met Ilara's over the boy's head. It was the first direct look since their arrival, and in it, she thought she saw not hostility, but a grudging acknowledgement. A silent understanding, perhaps, of a shared, simple human impulse. That small incident near the stream seemed to mark a subtle shift. The hostility from the camp members didn't vanish, but some of the rawest edges softened, replaced by a wary curiosity. The woman who brought her food began to meet her gaze, sometimes offering a curt nod. Children, emboldened, would occasionally dart close to her lodge, peeking in before scampering away with giggles. Ilara, in turn, started to observe more closely, her initial terror giving way to a reluctant fascination with the rhythms of Modoc life. She watched them tan hides with an efficiency that spoke of generations of knowledge, weave intricate baskets from willow shoots, and prepare food with ingredients foraged from the forest she had once feared. Their connection to the land was profound, a stark contrast to the settlers' view of it as something to be tamed and conquered. One evening, Sulek appeared at the entrance to her lodge. He carried no weapon, and his expression, while still serious, lacked the immediate threat it had once held. He gestured for her to come out. Hesitantly, she followed him to the edge of the camp, where the trees thinned, offering a view of the valley below, bathed in the amber light of the setting sun. For a long time, they stood in silence. Then, he spoke, his voice low. "Sky fire," he said, pointing to the vibrant sunset. It was English. Broken, accented, but intelligible. Ilara stared at him, astonished. He knew some of her language. He then pointed to a hawk circling overhead. "Sulek," he said, then tapped his own chest. He was telling her his name. And its meaning. Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. "Ilara," she managed, pointing to herself. He nodded slowly. Over the next few weeks, these brief, hesitant conversations continued. He would point to objects, tree, stone, river, and give the Modoc word, then sometimes, the English equivalent if he knew it. He spoke of the land, not as a possession, but as a living entity, sacred and sustaining. He told her, in fragmented sentences and expressive gestures, of those white ghosts who came, taking more and more, pushing his people from their ancestral homes, from the graves of their fathers. He didn't speak with anger, but with a deep, resonant sorrow that touched a chord within her. Ilara, in turn, began to share small pieces of her own life, her family's journey west, their hopes for a new farm, the simple joys she had known. She spoke of her mother's garden, her father's laughter. In sharing these fragments, they began to see beyond the labels of settler and Modoc. They saw individuals, each with their own histories, their own losses. The caricature of the savage warrior Ilara had carried in her mind began to crumble, replaced by the image of a man burdened by the fate of his people, a man capable of unexpected depths of understanding, even a quiet sorrow that mirrored her own. The fragile understanding developing between Ilara and Sulek, and by extension, a tentative tolerance from some of the camp, was shattered by the arrival of a hunting party bearing grim news. They had sighted a column of soldiers, larger than usual, moving with purpose through the traditional Modoc hunting grounds to the south. Their trail led ominously close to the hidden ravine where the band was camped. A pall of anxiety fell over the community. The men gathered in tense councils, their voices low and urgent. The women began to pack essential belongings with a grim efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with displacement. Ilara, though an outsider, could feel the fear radiating through the camp. It was a stark reminder that her presence, her very survival, was tied to the fate of these people. Sulek sought her out as dusk settled. His face was taut, his eyes reflecting the worry that gripped his tribe. "Soldiers come," he said, his English more clipped than usual. "Not good. For Modoc. For you." He explained that if the soldiers found the camp, there would be a fight. And if they found her, a white woman, among the Modoc, they would likely assume the worst, that she was a collaborator, or worse, a willing captive turned sympathizer. Her own people, ironically, could now pose as much a threat to her as the Modoc initially had. "You must hide," he told her, his gaze intense. "If fight comes, stay away." Far away he pressed a small, sharp skinning knife into her hand. "For you," he said simply. Not for defense against his people, she understood, but against the potential chaos, or perhaps even against herself if capture by the soldiers seemed inevitable and unbearable. The weight of the knife was cold and heavy in her palm. The implications of his words, of this shared danger, forged a new, more urgent bond between them. They were no longer just captor and captive, or representatives of warring cultures. They were two individuals facing a common threat, their survival intertwined. The camp prepared for either fight or flight. Ilara, under Sulek's quiet direction, helped gather dried foods and fill water skins, her earlier fears eclipsed by a sense of immediacy. She was no longer just a passive observer, she was part of their desperate preparation. The decision was made to move, to retreat deeper into the rugged, volcanic terrain of the lava beds, a natural fortress where the Modoc had historically found refuge. The soldiers were too numerous, their intentions clearly hostile. The evacuation began before dawn, a silent, ghostly procession under a starless sky. Children were carried, the elderly supported, belongings kept to a minimum. Ilara, her ankle now mostly healed, walked with Sulek near the rear of the column. He moved with a heightened alertness, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from the old rifle slung across his back. The journey was arduous, far more difficult than her initial trek to the camp. They climbed over jagged rocks, navigated narrow fissures, and pushed through dense chaparral that tore at their clothes and skin. Ilara, though exhausted, kept pace, driven by a primal will to survive and a surprising, burgeoning loyalty to the man who had spared her life and now seemed determined to protect it further. Twice, they heard the distant sound of bugles, a chilling reminder of the pursuing soldiers. Each time, the column froze, melting into the landscape until the sounds faded. During one such halt, huddled in a shallow crevice, Sulek shared a piece of his dwindling jerky with her. "They hunt us," he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity but edged with a weary anger. "Like animals. This land is ours. We were born here. Our fathers are buried here. Ilara looked at his strong, grim profile, at the pain etched around his eyes, and for the first time, she began to truly grasp the depth of the injustice his people faced. Her own loss was immense, but it was individual. His was the loss of a nation, a way of life. As they pressed on, a small group of warriors, including Sulek, peeled off to create diversions, to lead the soldiers away from the main body of refugees. Ilara watched him disappear into the grey, rocky landscape, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. He had given her no special instructions before leaving, only a shared look that spoke volumes, of trust, of shared peril. She was now with the women, children, and elders, her fate indistinguishable from theirs. She found herself helping an elderly woman navigate a particularly treacherous patch of loose scree, her hand steadying the frail arm. The woman offered her a rare, toothless smile of gratitude. In that moment, Ilara felt a sense of belonging, however temporary, however fraught with danger. She was no longer just Ilara, the settler girl. She was part of this desperate flight, sharing their hardship, their fear, and their fierce resilience. Hours later, as the exhausted group found temporary shelter in a well-hidden cave system, word came back via a swift runner. Sulek and his small band had successfully engaged a patrol of soldiers, drawing them into a confusing network of canyons, buying precious time for the others. But the cost had been high. 2 warriors were dead, and another, a young man named Hota who had sometimes shared a quiet smile with Ilara, was gravely wounded. Sulek himself was unaccounted for, last seen providing covering fire as the others retreated. A cold dread gripped Ilara. The thought of Sulek, who had shown her such unexpected humanity, lying dead or wounded in those desolate rocks was unbearable. The cave was somber, the air thick with unspoken fears and quiet grief. Hota lay on a bed of furs, his breathing shallow, a dark stain spreading on the bandage around his thigh. The medicine woman of the tribe worked over him, her face grim, chanting softly, but his chances looked slim. Ilara felt a surge of helplessness, then a flicker of determination. Her mother had some knowledge of herbs and healing, basic skills passed down. She hesitantly approached the medicine woman, an elder named Wymer, whose eyes held a deep wisdom and sorrow. Using gestures and the few Modoc words she had learned, mixed with simple English, Ilara tried to offer help. She knew about cleaning wounds thoroughly, about pressure to stop bleeding, things that might supplement Wymer's traditional methods. At first, Wymer was dismissive, her gaze skeptical. But Hota's condition was worsening. Desperation, and perhaps something she saw in Ilara's earnest eyes, made her relent. She allowed Ilara to assist, watching her carefully. Ilara cleaned the wound as best she could with the limited supplies, her hand surprisingly steady. She showed Wymer how to apply more direct pressure using a tightly rolled piece of hide. They worked together, 2 women from vastly different worlds, united by the urgent need to save a life. As dawn approached, Hota's breathing seemed a little easier, the bleeding stanched. He was still in grave danger, but there was a sliver of hope. Wymer looked at Ilara, a long, assessing gaze. Then, she nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Just then, a figure stumbled into the cave entrance, silhouetted against the grey morning light. He was covered in dust and grime, his clothes torn, but he was alive. It was Sulek. A collective sigh of relief went through the cave. Ilara's heart leaped. He was weary, his face etched with exhaustion and grief for his fallen comrades, but he was whole. His eyes found Ilara, kneeling beside Hota. He saw the makeshift bandage, the concern on her face, the quiet collaboration with Wymer. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had fought to protect his people, and she, in her own way, had done the same. The wall between them, already crumbling, seemed to dissolve a little more in that shared moment of relief and quiet understanding. With the immediate threat of the soldiers temporarily abated, though they knew it was only a reprieve, a tense quiet settled over the Modoc band in their cave sanctuary. The fate of Ilara became a pressing, unspoken question. She was an anomaly, a settler woman who had not only survived among them but had shown courage and a willingness to help. Yet, she was still one of them, a representative of the people who were systematically destroying the Modoc way of life. The elders, including the grave man Sulek had first spoken to upon her arrival, convened a council. Sulek was present, his voice low but firm as he spoke, gesturing occasionally towards Ilara, who sat apart, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She couldn't understand the words, but she could read the faces. Some were hard, suspicious. Others, like Weimer, seemed more contemplative. She knew Sulek was arguing for her, recounting her actions, perhaps emphasizing the humanity she had shown. He spoke of Hota, now sleeping fitfully but alive, thanks in part to her intervention. He might have spoken of the way she had endured the journey, her resilience. But the weight of history, of broken treaties and brutal skirmishes, was a heavy presence in that cave. After what felt like an eternity, the council concluded. The elder approached Ilara. Sulek stood beside him, translating. "You are not Modoc," the elder stated, his voice resonating with authority. "You cannot stay with us. The path of our people is hard, and your presence brings more danger, more questions." Ilara's heart sank, though she had expected this. A part of her, strangely, had begun to feel a sense of belonging in this harsh, fugitive existence, a connection to these resilient people and to Sulek. But the elder continued, his gaze unwavering, "You are not an enemy. You have shown courage. You have shown a good heart to Hota. Sulek speaks for you. He says you understand our sorrow." He paused. "Sulek will take you to a place where your people are. From there, your path is your own." Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a profound sadness. Leaving meant safety, a return to what was familiar, but it also meant leaving Sulek, leaving behind this intense, transformative period of her life. She looked at Sulek. His face was unreadable, but she sensed the conflict within him too. He had saved her life, and now he was responsible for returning her to a world that was, in essence, at war with his own. The decision was made. It was logical, necessary. But it felt like another kind of loss, a severing of a bond forged in shared adversity and unexpected understanding. The journey back towards the settled lands was a somber affair. Sulek and Ilara traveled mostly in silence, a stark contrast to their earlier, tentative efforts at communication. Now, there was too much to say, and yet, words seemed inadequate. The landscape, once alien and terrifying to Ilara, now held a different significance. She saw not just rocks and trees, but the places where Sulek's people had hunted, worshipped, and hidden. She understood, with a clarity that ached, what they were fighting to protect. They traveled for 2 days, carefully avoiding patrols, Sulek's skills keeping them safe. On the second evening, they made camp in a small, sheltered copse overlooking a valley where, in the distance, the faint lights of a settlement flickered, a world Ilara had once longed for, but now approached with a complex mix of trepidation and sorrow. Sulek built a small fire. He shared his meager rations with her, as he always had. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet, "you go there." He gestured towards the lights. "You will be safe." Ilara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Safe, yes. But changed. Irrevocably changed. "Sulek," she began, then faltered. "Thank you." For everything. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion he rarely showed. "You showed heart, Ilara." Not all white eyes are blind. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. It was the little wooden bird she had given to the woman in the camp, the one who brought her food. The woman must have given it to him. He pressed it into Ilara's hand. "Remember," he said. "Remember the land. Remember the people." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. "I will," she whispered. "I will never forget." The dawn came too quickly. They stood at the edge of the wilderness, the boundary between two worlds. Sulek pointed her towards a barely visible track that led down into the valley. "Go now," he said, his voice rough. "Do not look back." Ilara wanted to say more, to express the profound impact he and his people had had on her, but the words wouldn't come. She simply met his gaze, hoping her eyes conveyed what her tongue could not. He gave a single, curt nod, then turned and melted back into the forest, becoming one with the shadows as silently as he had first appeared in her life. Ilara watched until he was gone, the small wooden bird clutched tightly in her hand. Then, with a heavy heart, she turned and began her descent, carrying with her not just the memory of terror and loss, but of unexpected kindness, profound resilience, and a bridge of understanding built between two souls in a world determined to tear them apart. She knew her life would never be the same. The Modoc warrior had been expected to kill her, but he had, in the most profound way, given her a new life, a new sight with which to see the world.